Humans vanish silently, and the council finally pays for its mistake. The floor began to shake before the official execution order left the high desk. It was a low, heavy vibration that rattled the small ceramic mug in Director Clara Vance's hand, causing the dark Terran liquid inside to ripple against the chipped rim. The sound came from the deep substructures of the Grand Assembly Tribunal, tuned to a frequency that made smaller species feel physically weak. Archon Rule did not look down at the human delegation as he cleared his throat. He sat on the highest tier of the long stone dais, his gold-rimmed eyes tracking a line of red data that scrolled across his personal screen. His long, three-fingered digits held a heavy stylus made of black glass, tapping it against the stone with a rhythmic, sharp click. "The petition for a temporary injunction is denied," Rule said, his voice carrying through the vaulted ceiling without the aid of a microphone. Under Clause 81 of the Hegemony Charter, the 14 sovereign border shipyards are now property of the Korath Hegemony. Demilitarization will begin at the next orbital rotation. High above the central well, the three-syllable names of ancient dynasties flickered on the white walls, a reminder of the thousands of worlds that had accepted these laws without a struggle. The air in the massive room smelled of recycled air and the mineral bite of ion-filtered light. Director Vance did not raise her voice to protest. She stood in her coarse, heavy wool coat that did not catch the light of the high monitors, her face showing nothing but a flat mathematical focus. She lifted the ceramic container, took a measured, slow sip of the bitter infusion, and looked directly up at the Archon's metallic crest. 1,400 citizens remain on those gantries under legal contracts, Vance said. Her voice was flat, dry, and entirely devoid of the panic the chamber usually produced. They are engineers, dock workers, and clerks. Your current directive gives them less than 12 hours to clear 70,000 tons of infrastructure. Archon Rule did not stop the rhythmic clicking of his stylus. His scales turned a faint gray along the edges of his neck, a gesture of casual dismissal that every junior clerk in the lower tiers recognized. The 12-hour window is a matter of administrative record, Director. It cannot be altered for late arrivals. If your people do not leave the cradles, the kinetic enforcement fleet will clear them by force. Vance did not look down at her notes. She set the mug on the metal rail before her with a soft thud. "We spent 70 years learning your laws, Archon. It is a pity you never took the time to study our logistics." She turned on her heel and walked toward the high entry doors. They hissed open to let her through, then sealed behind her with a heavy, pressurized sigh that left the central well completely silent. "I wish I could tell you the warning ended there. It didn't. Stay close." 3 hours after the human delegation left the assembly, Senior Analyst Tarek sat 3 tiers below the high dais, his multi-lens optical array twitching as he monitored the incoming data streams from Sector 4. The Grand Assembly floor had returned to its normal business, the voices of 3 separate alien trade groups arguing over mineral rights in the outer systems. Tarek adjusted his console, his mandibles contracting slightly as a new line of text blinked at the top of his display. It was a routine status report from the primary transit hub, but the value in the terminal column was unusual. It read 0. "Kessin," Tarek whispered, not looking away from his screen. He called to the junior clerk at the adjacent terminal, whose eyes were blinking rapidly under the glare of the status board. "Check the secondary receiver for the border yards. The main feed is showing an interruption." Kessin did not look up. He tapped his input slate twice with a clawed finger. "The humans are likely packing their personal files." Sub-Commander Valther said their small ships were already shifting toward the outer marker. "They aren't shifting," Tarek said, his fingers moving across the interface to pull up the raw tonnage logs. "To move that much mass without a single collision requires a pre-computed routing matrix. Look at the dock registers." The screen did not show a slow decrease in activity. Every single docking cradle across 14 separate stations had reported a simultaneous disconnect at exactly 04:00 Galactic Standard Time. The automated manifests had been signed off not by individual station masters, but by a single administrative override code registered to Vance's office. Across the room, Subcommander Valther was scratching his heavy armor plates, laughing as he spoke to a tactical officer. "They left the scrap behind," Valther said, his voice booming over the low hum of the floor. "A race of freight handlers does not fight a kinetic fleet. They run the moment the shadow of a cruiser touches their glass huts." Tarix did not join the laughter. He pulled up the core comm lanes. The arterial grid that tracked the transponder signatures of every commercial freighter, courier, and long-range shuttle within 3 sectors of the Hegemony core. The blue lines that normally filled the display like a thick web had vanished. It was not a total communications blackout, which would indicate a localized equipment failure or a solar storm. The Hegemony transponders were still active, their small green dots moving at standard sublight speeds. But every human vessel, from the massive ore carriers to the single-seat repair skiffs, had gone dark at the same millisecond. "They didn't run," Tarix muttered, his optical lenses shifting focus as he opened a deeper archive. His stress cell began to show, his mandibles twitching in a rapid rhythm against his lower jaw. "They didn't run. They turned off the lights." He bypassed the standard logistical filters and began to review 7 years of fuel consumption records for the outer territories. The Hegemony collected a 3% energy tax on all commercial antimatter transfers, logged through automated substations. For nearly a decade, the human freight companies had reported a steady, minor efficiency loss across their entire fleet, a fraction of a percent every month, attributed to aging magnetic seals. Tarix did not look at the reported percentages. He looked at the raw volume of the transfers. When he calculated the total deficit across 12 separate sectors, the small fractions disappeared, replaced by a massive, real-world discrepancy. 42 million metric tons of enriched antimatter were missing from the central ledger. The fuel had been paid for, logged as lost to technical wear, and transferred into containers that did not appear on any military census. "Where is the fuel analyst?" Tarix jumped slightly, his optical array spinning before locking onto the towering figure of Archon Rule. The high official had descended from the dais, his gold-rimmed eyes cold as he looked down at Tarix's screen. "The human yards are empty, sir," Tarix said, his fingers shaking as he pulled up the first images from the scouting vessels. "The first fleet reached the perimeter 20 minutes ago. They found the docking clamps plasma-welded from the inside. Then we will cut them open," Rule said, his voice flat. "The infrastructure belongs to the Hegemony now. A few welded gates will not stop our engineers." "It is not just the gates, Archon," Tarix said. He brought up the structural scans of the main production gantry. They filled the central core of every station with millions of tons of hardened structural foam before they left. "The reactors are gone. The wiring has been pulled. They left the metal shell, but they filled it like a solid rock." Rule's mouth did not move. He adjusted the gold trim on his sleeve, his posture rigid. "Childish spite. They ruined their own tools because they knew they could not keep them. It changes nothing. The territory is secured." "Sir," Tarix said, pointing to the bottom of the fuel audit. "The 42 million tons. They didn't leave it behind, and they didn't use it to flee." Before the Archon could answer, the artificial mechanical hum of the Grand Assembly Tribunal changed its pitch. The steady vibration that had filled the room for a century dropped 3 octaves, turning into a deep, physical growl that rattled the stone floor. The lights inside the high vaulted ceiling flickered once, died, and were replaced by the dim orange glow of the emergency backup cells. "Report," Rule barked, turning toward the high tactical station where the officers were already shouting over their dead consoles. "Is this a reactor failure in the lower tiers?" "No, Archon," the tactical officer called out, her fingers slamming into a non-responsive panel. "The primary fusion tap is online, but something is drawing from the Citadel's core gravity displacement field. It is pulling the power straight out of the grid." Tarix did not look at the power grid. He looked at the long-range sensor array that was still running on battery power. On the dark screen, just outside the high viewports of the assembly chamber, 6,400 automated objects were dropping out of the Lagrange blind spots. They did not look like standard war vessels. They had no weapon turrets, no kinetic shield generators, and no sleek armored plating. They were heavy, blocky rectangles of unpainted gray metal, each one carrying a massive, circular coil that occupied 3/4 of its mass. "They aren't targeting our hulls," Tarex whispered, his voice cracking as he watched the first barge ignite its central grid. "They've anchored their magnetic coils directly into our planetary drive grids." The massive gray rectangles did not maneuver like war fleets. They did not take up tactical positions or adjust their vectors to avoid the defensive fire of the Citadel's outer ring. Instead, they dropped into the low orbital path, their huge circular structures glowing with a bright white light that seemed to eat the color out of the surrounding sky. Archon Rule slammed his long digits onto the edge of the lower console, his gold-rimmed eyes widening as the screen before him flickered and died. "Tell the First Fleet to deploy their primary batteries," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high stone walls. "They are unarmored transport barges. Clear them from the sector." "The transmission will not clear, sir," the tactical officer said. Her fingers were no longer tapping. She was hitting the manual mechanical overrides beneath her desk. "The communications matrix is drawing zero current. The signal cables are cold." Tarex watched the main tactical display drop its resolution, the sharp blue icons of the Hegemony defense ships turning into thick, yellow blocks of static. The 6,400 barges were not emitting a standard jamming frequency. They were drawing the planetary magnetic field into their coils, using the Citadel's own massive energy infrastructure to create a closed inductive circuit. Outside the viewports, the 6 Pride cruisers of the Hegemony core fleet did not explode. They did not burn. Instead, their long blue propulsion trails began to contract, shortening from brilliant spears of light into small, pale sparks. The ships began to drift, their stabilization thrusters dying in sequence as the magnetic field locked their internal drive cores into a dead freeze. "They aren't killing us," Tarex said, his voice dropping into a dry whisper that felt like sand in his throat. He looked at the secondary power ledger, where the energy values for the entire military sector were dropping toward the bottom of the column. "They are rendering us obsolete." The great hall of the Grand Assembly had lost its artificial vibration entirely. The low hum that had defined the room for 100 years was replaced by an empty, hollow silence that made the voices of the lower clerks sound thin and fragile. The 3 pieces of Rule's broken glass stylus sat on the stone floor, dark and unmoving under the dim orange emergency lights. Rule turned back toward the lower tier, his scales tightening until they showed white lines across his throat. "Where is Director Vance?" "She left the perimeter 3 minutes before the grid dropped, Archon," Kessin said from the adjacent desk. The junior clerk was no longer checking his logs. His hands were tucked into his sleeves to stop their visible shaking. "Her shuttle used a compressed gas launch. No active drive signature." Tarex did not look for the shuttle. His optical array was locked on the fuel consumption records he had pulled from the deep archives before the lights failed. He looked at the 42 million tons of missing antimatter, then looked back at the unpainted gray barges outside the glass. The math was not an approximation. The humans had not hidden the fuel to build an army. They had calculated the exact amount of energy required to ground every Hegemony vessel within 40 light years. Every month of minor efficiency losses over the last 7 years had been a deliberate deposit into an invisible bank of tactical pressure. "They knew the law would fail," Tarex muttered, his mandibles twitching as he traced the routing lines. "They didn't build these barges after we denied the injunction. They built them while we were still drafting the clause." The subcommander Valther moved toward the exit, his heavy plate armor clanking in the quiet room. "The secondary garrison at Sector 4 has a separate backup grid. I will take a sublight shuttle and bring the reserve divisions." "The hub at Sector 4 is empty, Subcommander," Tarex said, not looking up from his fading screen. "The automated registers signed off 3 hours ago. There are no pilots there. There are no engineers. There are only the empty cradles." Valther stopped by the high bronze doors, his fingers catching the handle. Then we will fly the ships ourselves. A hegemony officer does not need a human maintenance crew to prime a kinetic battery. You do if they took the software cores with them, Tarek said. He pointed to the terminal data drop that was still visible on his emergency battery. They didn't just leave the stations. They cleared the operational matrices from the central network. The ships don't know how to talk to the guns anymore. The silence returned to the chamber, heavier than before. Archon Rule walked back to his high seat, his movements slower now, the aristocratic gait gone. He looked at the vaulted ceiling, where the names of the ancient dynasties were now dark, their white light extinguished by the power drop. We have 3 months of emergency rations in the lower levels, Rule said, his voice thin but steady. The planetary defense grid is grounded, but the walls are thick. They cannot storm a fortress of this scale with unarmored barges. They aren't trying to storm it, sir, Tarek said. He leaned closer to the interface, his lenses shifting as he detected a minor fluctuation in the secondary comm lane. They aren't sending troops. They aren't issuing demands. A low, single tone came through the primary speaker on the high dais, the only piece of equipment that had retained its power. It was a standard administrative handshake signal, the kind used by cargo haulers to announce an incoming manifest. The display did not show a military threat or a declaration of war. It showed a legal brief, formatted in the exact style of the Hegemony Court of Claims. At the top of the page, beneath the official seal of the Sovereign Logistics Bureau, a new title had been logged into the public record. The text read, "The Charter of Armed Sovereignty." Tarek looked up from the screen, his optical array twitching rapidly as he looked toward the high entryway. The bronze doors were closed, but the small indicator light above the frame had turned from red to a cold, steady blue. Someone was standing on the other side of the seal, and they had not used an administrative key to open it. The blue indicator light above the frame did not blink. It stayed solid, a bright dot that cast a thin line of color across the cracked pieces of Archon Rule's glass stylus. Then the heavy bronze doors moved. They did not hiss open with the usual pressurized speed of the Citadel's systems. Instead, they ground backward into the stone slots with a slow, mechanical groan, pushed by an external hydraulic lift that had been clamped to the security frame from the outside. Director Clara Vance walked back into the central well of the chamber. Her coarse, heavy wool coat was damp along the shoulders from the condensation in the lower transit tubes, and she still held her chipped ceramic container, though no steam rose from the rim now. Behind her, 2 human transit clerks carried a heavy, square storage crate made of industrial-gray plastic, setting it down on the lower administrative rail with a dull, metallic thud. Subcommander Valther reached for the side of his armor, his hand automatically closing around the grip of his sidearm. "You are under arrest for structural sabotage, Director," he shouted, stepping down from the middle tier. "Order your automated vessels to drop their magnetic anchors, or the security forces will clear this well with kinetic fire." Vance did not look at him. She did not raise her hand to show she heard the threat. She walked to the center of the resonant frequency floor, looked up at the darkened dais where Archon Rule sat, and placed her ceramic mug on the flat surface of the high desk. "The security forces are currently tracking their own life support margins, Subcommander," Vance said, her voice dry and measured in the cold air. "The atmospheric scrubbers in the lower garrisons dropped to half capacity 4 minutes ago. Your men aren't looking for ammunition. They are looking for portable oxygen tanks." Tarek checked the lower corner of his secondary display, where the battery-powered diagnostics were still scrolling. The numbers confirmed her statement. The inductive circuit created by the 6,400 barges was not just locking the propulsion drives. It was pulling the power directly out of the Citadel's internal environmental loops. The grid was prioritizing the High Council's immediate physical platform, leaving the lower military quarters to chill. Archon Rule leaned forward, his 3-fingered digits gripping the edge of the high dais until the gold trim on his sleeves creaked. "This is an act of total war, Director. The Korath Hegemony has dismantled 3 species for less than this. Do you believe your freight haulers can outlast our reserve fleets when they return from the outer margin?" "We don't believe anything, Archon," Vance said. She touched the top of the gray plastic crate, her fingers moving across the manual latches. "We checked the math. That is why we are here." She pulled the manual lever on the side of the container. A small, blue projection field rose from the center of the unit, displaying a line of text that did not match the legal formatting of the Hegemony Charter. It was a terminal registry file, listing thousands of individual entries in plain English text. Tarex leaned closer to his screen, his optical lenses twitching as he recognized the nature of the data drop. This was not a military manifesto or a list of strategic demands. It was a casualty log from the border shipyards, time-stamped during the initial 12-hour evacuation window that Rule had decreed 3 hours earlier. 1402, Vance said. She did not look at the scrolling text. She looked directly at Rule's pale gray scales. "That is the number of human citizens who died on the gantries when your kinetic enforcement fleet initiated the clearance protocol at Sector 4. They were contractual laborers, clear of your military baseline. Your sub-commander did not wait for the transit window to close before he opened fire on the docking cradles." The hall became entirely quiet. Sub-Commander Valther did not drop his hand from his sidearm, but his fingers did not move to unlatch the safety. He looked toward the high dais, waiting for the Archon to deny the log. Rule did not deny it. He adjusted his posture, his gold-rimmed eyes tracking the names as they moved across the blue light. "An administrative error, Director. In any large-scale relocation, minor losses occur within the margins of enforcement. The hegemony courts handle financial compensation for contractual disruption after the territory is stabilized." "The territory is not being stabilized," Vance said, her voice dropping into a low, flat tone that carried no anger, only an absolute certainty. "And this is not a claim for financial compensation." She reached into her dark coat pocket, her hand coming out with a small, metallic memory core that did not carry an administrative seal. It was an older, human-style data block, its edges worn from years of use in the freight offices. Tarex watched her fingers set the core next to the cold ceramic mug. His stress-tell began to show again, his mandibles contracting in a sharp, irregular rhythm as a new line of alert metrics blinked on his console. The alert did not come from the barges outside the glass. It came from the deep subspace relays, 40 light-years away on the Sol 3 defensive margin. The human homeworld had not launched a defensive fleet. They had not moved their cruisers into the border sectors. Instead, a secondary signal had begun to propagate through the hegemony's dead comm lanes. A pre-recorded data package that was automatically unsealing inside every civilian transit hub from the core to the outer rim. "What is that signal, analyst?" Rule asked, his voice losing its aristocratic edge as he noticed the blue light flashing on Tarex's station. Tarex did not look up. His fingers were frozen over the input slate as the full scale of the routing matrix became clear on his screen. "It is a legal lock, Archon. They aren't just targeting our fleets. They've transmitted a pre-computed precedent override to every autonomous court registry in the Empire." Archon Rule did not look at the flashing alert. He kept his gold-rimmed eyes fixed on Director Vance, his mandibles tightening until they clicked against his lower jaw. "A court registry lock cannot freeze a military directive," he said, his voice flat and thin in the cold room. "The legal architecture of this empire is backed by kinetic force. A computer entry does not change the ownership of 40 light-years of sovereign space. It does when your own automated systems are the ones enforcing it," Vance said. She did not raise her voice. She reached down, took her coarse wool coat by the lapels, and straightened the heavy fabric. "We didn't know you would try to take our yards. We hoped you wouldn't, but we checked the math and we prepared for your mistake." She reached out and tapped the top of the gray plastic crate. The blue projection field changed its shape, the casualty logs disappearing, replaced by the full text of the hegemony's original assimilation decree. Beside the official seal of the High Council, a new subclause began to flash in a bright, dull blue. Tarex watched the columns of data shift on his emergency screen, his optical lenses spinning as the nature of the trap became clear. The humans had not fought the legal definition of assimilation. They had accepted it. For 70 years, every administrative report, every maintenance contract, and every fuel requisition form they had submitted had been written in a specific, multi-layered vocabulary. They had used the hegemony's own legal precedents to define their civilian transport companies as a foundational infrastructure utility. Under Clause 81, the moment an asset was designated as a foundation utility, it became legally inseparable from the planetary drive grids it served. By seizing the yards, the Korath Hegemony had automatically integrated the human barges into the core operating network of the Citadel itself. Sub-Commander Valther turned toward the high tactical station, his boots clicking loudly on the stone floor. "Tell the garrison to disconnect the primary trunk lines manually," he ordered, his hand slamming into the metal rail. "Cut the physical links." "We can't, sir," the tactical officer called back. Her voice had lost its mechanical discipline. "The automated maintenance locks are engaged. The system is treating the human barges as a central safety mechanism. If we pull the cables, the network will trigger a total reactor collapse to protect the core." The silence returned, heavier than before. The dim orange backup cells cast long, distorted shadows across the vaulted walls. Vance reached out, her fingers closing around the cold handle of her ceramic mug. She did not lift it to drink. She simply moved it 3 inches across the metal table, the unglazed bottom making a soft, scraping sound in the quiet well. "The Charter of Armed Sovereignty has already been logged into the Central Archive," Vance said, looking up at the high dais. "The automated registries have processed the casualty data from Sector 4, 1,402 dead. Under your own maritime law, that is a terminal breach of administrative trust. The yards are no longer a matter of dispute. They are legally dead space." Archon Rule sat back in his high stone chair, his pale gray scales turning a dull, mottled white under the emergency lights. He looked down at the 3 broken pieces of his glass stylus on the floor. The aristocratic gait was entirely gone. He was no longer an administrator delivering a sentence. He was a clerk staring at a balance sheet that had run out of columns. Behind the high desks, the representatives of the other 3 alien trade groups began to whisper, their low, clicked dialects filling the lower tiers like the sound of dry grass in the wind. They were not looking at the Archon for leadership. They were looking at the blue terminal screens that were still active on their personal slates, watching the legal cascade dismantle their own logistical priorities one system at a time. Tarex checked the terminal logs again. The precedent override was expanding exponentially through the network, unsealing older constitutional counterweights that the hegemony had forgotten existed. The human automated fleet outside wasn't firing weapons, because the legal lock had already stripped the Citadel's authority to command a retaliation. Vance did not wait for a formal response. She did not demand a speech, and she did not issue an ultimatum. She turned back toward the entry doors, her heavy wool coat brushing against the plastic crate as she moved. The 2 human clerks followed her, their boots making a rhythmic, steady thud that grew fainter as they reached the edge of the central well. "Director," Rule called out, his voice thin and hollow in the vaulted room, "if the Council does not ratify your charter, your barges will remain in orbit. You will lock your own people out of the sector forever." Vance stopped by the bronze frame, her hand resting on the manual override lever. She did not look back at the dais. "The math is done, Archon. We've already logged out." She pulled the lever. The heavy doors ground forward into the stone slots, sealing the chamber from the outside with a deep, mechanical clunk that left the central well completely dark save for the blue glow of the memory core on the table. Tarex sat at his station, his fingers resting on the cold input slate as the primary tactical screen dropped its final metric. The 6,400 barges outside the glass remained unmoving, their white coils burning steady holes into the planetary night. The ships of the First Fleet drifted in the low orbit, their hulls dark, their propulsion trails gone. Inside the chamber, the low hum did not return. An automated cleaning drone in the corner of the lower tier began to move, its small wheels clicking against the resonant frequency stone as it swept the dust from the empty well. Archon Rule did not move from his seat. He sat slumped against the high back of his chair, his long digits twitching slightly against the gold trim of his sleeve, staring down at the bare desk where the cold ceramic mug sat alone.